Hope you're having a great weekend so far, and I'm so glad that you've carved out the time to be here today. And let me give a big shout out to those of you who are watching right now online from coffee shops and living rooms and college dorm rooms all over Pennsylvania and beyond. Great to have you guys with us as well. Everybody in the room, let's make the online campus feel welcome. All right. And this is the final week in this teaching series called How Not to Be Your Own Worst Enemy. So over the last few weeks, we've been talking about the fact that every single one of us has the potential to become our own worst enemy. That at one time or another, we all make decisions or we put ourselves in situations where we end up bringing pain into our lives and into the lives of people around us. And so we've been talking about how not to do that, how to live wisely, how to live in such a way that we don't become our own worst enemy. And today, I want to talk about what I think is the biggest issue in making these kinds of foolish decisions, the heart attitude behind becoming your own worst enemy. And I think it's simply this. I think it's pride. I think pride often blinds us to the traps that we're about to walk into. Pride is dangerous. I think pride has the power to turn you into your own worst enemy. There was a guy in the 80s who decided to step into the world of professional boxing. His name was James Tillis, and he eventually went on to have a pretty good career as a heavyweight boxer. He got the nickname Quick Tillis because his hands would move so fast. His punches were so quick. And when he began his professional boxing career, he had to actually relocate from his little hometown in Oklahoma to the city of Chicago. And in his autobiography, he describes what happened when he stepped off the bus in the city of Chicago on that very first day. He says, I got off the bus with 2 suitcases under my arms in downtown Chicago and stopped in front of the Sears Tower. I put my suitcases down, I looked up at the tower and shouted, I'm going to conquer Chicago. When I looked down, my suitcases were gone. And see, pride can be a very dangerous thing. When we get caught up in our own glory, our own success, when we get focused on ourselves, we become very vulnerable, and the enemy of your soul will steal from you the joy in your life, and you can end up becoming your own worst enemy. So what we've been doing during this series is just talking about 4 habits. And if I call them preemptive habits, because if we can live with these habits, we can preempt those foolish decisions. And so we began this series talking about habit number 1, which is think long term. In other words, when you have a decision to make, don't think about it just in terms of the emotions and the circumstances of the moment. Think about how that decision will look, not just 10 minutes from now, but 10 months and 10 years from now. Think long term, not short term. Habit number 2 we talked about was this one: listen to wise counsel. In other words, surround yourself with people whose lives are deeply rooted in God's wisdom, and then allow them to speak into your life. Turn down the wrong voices in your life. Turn up the right voices. Listen to wise counsel. And then last week, habit number 3 was don't look for loopholes. In other words, when you're coming to that decision point, don't try to talk yourself out of what you know is the right thing to do. Don't find reasons to not do what you know you should do. Don't think that you're the exception. Don't think that you're different. Don't think it doesn't apply to you. Just trust God. Follow His leadership. Don't look for loopholes. Now today, the last habit is very simple. Stay humble. Avoid pride. Stay humble. Now, before we really get into that, I want to answer a question that may be running through your mind right now. Some of you might be thinking, well, Mark, is pride always wrong? Like, is it okay to be proud of my kids? Is it okay to take pride in the job that I do? Is it okay to say I'm proud to be an American? Things like that. And I would say there is a healthy sense of pride. It's good to rejoice in someone else's success, especially your kids. It's good to take pride in the way you do your work or pride in ownership. There's that good sense of pride. But that can easily and quickly and so subtly begin to morph into something that's much darker and much more destructive. And that's the kind of pride we're talking about today. That destructive kind of pride. In fact, let me just give you a 3-word warning that would summarize everything that we're going to talk about today. And it's this: pride is poisonous. Pride really is poisonous. And this idea comes from something I learned when I was visiting an aquarium in Atlanta last year. And in one of the tanks there, they had what's called a puffer fish. Not the most attractive fish in the world, but a pufferfish has this unique defense mechanism. When they're threatened by a predator, they'll actually suck in water and make themselves look about 3 times bigger than they really are, so that they look a little bit more menacing. But even if that doesn't work, even if they're attacked and eaten by a predator fish, the pufferfish always gets the last word. They get their revenge because they have a poison in their bodies that is toxic. In fact, there's enough toxin in one of these fish to kill like 30 people. So I thought about this as a good picture of what pride does. You see, when pride begins to fill our hearts, we puff ourselves up, we make ourselves look bigger, but the very thing that we use to make ourselves look bigger will eventually poison us and poison our lives. In fact, let me get very specific. I believe, first of all, that pride poisons our relationships. You know, whenever there's a conflict in a relationship, if you look deep enough, you'll eventually discover that it's rooted at least partly in pride. The book of Proverbs says this: pride only breeds quarrels, but wisdom is found in those who take advice. In other words, pride is what makes us unwilling to admit that we're wrong. Pride is what makes us unwilling to compromise. Pride is what makes you continue to argue your point even after you realize that your point isn't even valid. Pride is what makes you unwilling to admit that you need help when everybody around you knows that you don't have a clue what you're doing. Pride is what crowds out other people, because when we're full of us, then we have no time or room for other people in our lives. Pride poisons our relationships. And then secondly, I would say this: I believe that pride poisons our faith. Because faith, by its very nature, requires dependence upon God, but pride, by its very nature, is dependence upon ourselves. It's the attitude that says, you know what, I don't really need God. My life is going just fine, thank you very much. King David, who wrote many of the Psalms, wrote this in Psalm 10. He says, in his pride, the wicked man does not seek God. In all his thoughts, there is no room for God. Pride, I believe, is the biggest reason why people do not seek God's free gift of grace and forgiveness, do not turn to him for help, do not build a relationship with him, accept the sacrifice of Christ, because pride keeps us from that. So pride will poison our relationships, it will poison our faith, but here's what we want to talk about today. Pride poisons our judgment. Pride, it says in Proverbs, goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. So when your heart becomes filled with the poison of pride, you begin to think you're invisible. Not invisible, invincible. Maybe invisible too, but invincible. You begin to think you're invincible. You begin to think that, hey, I got this all figured out. I'm the exception. I'll be fine. And when you get to that point, you are standing on a spiritual and moral banana peel. You're going to go down. Pride goes before destruction. Pride is poison. It'll turn you into your own worst enemy. Now, as we talk about this, let me tell you the biggest challenge in giving a message on pride. The biggest challenge in talking about this issue is that most of us don't think we have a problem with pride. It's very difficult for us to see it in ourselves. Like, as a pastor, I've had people come and talk to me about all kinds of problems. Depression, addiction, relationship challenges. I've never once had somebody try to schedule an appointment with me to come in and talk about their pride problem, because we don't see it in ourselves. We see it clearly in other people, but we often don't see the pride in our own hearts. In fact, I'll give you an example of that. There's this online dating website called OkCupid. And like a lot of online dating websites, when you go on there to register, they have you answer a whole bunch of questions so that they can figure out who you might be compatible with. But on this particular one, they have an interesting question. It's this question: are you a genius? That's an interesting question. Believe it or not, 47% of men answer yes. Okay, guys, statistically, it's impossible for half of us to be geniuses, even with the most generous definition of that word, okay? But see, we're prideful sometimes and we don't even see it. We see it in other people. We don't see it in ourselves, because pride seeps into our hearts so slowly and it's hard to detect. So today, let's all take an honest look at our own hearts and our own lives and try to see if there might be some growing indications of pride that has the potential to poison us and make us our own worst enemies. And we're going to look today at a story in the Bible of a man named Uzziah. In the book of 2 Chronicles, in what Christians call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, the word chronicle just means record of history. So the Chronicles of Narnia, that was the history of Narnia. The 1st and 2nd Chronicles is the history of the Jewish people. And in chapter 26 of 2 Chronicles, you find the story of Uzziah. He was one of the kings of the nation of Israel, actually Judah, the southern kingdom. But Uzziah was a king, and his story is a fascinating example. You may have never heard his story, but it's a fascinating example of how pride seeps into our hearts and can eventually destroy us. So as we think about his life, I want you to think about 4 different scenes. Imagine scrolling through his Instagram feed, and you get different pictures at different times in his life. And the first snapshot, the first picture is this: Uzziah as a learner. It says, "Then all the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and made him king in place of his father Amaziah. He was the one who rebuilt Elath and restored it to Judah after Amaziah rested with his fathers. Uzziah was 16 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 52 years. Now, in those days and in that culture, when the king passed away, they didn't hold an election for the next king. Typically, power was handed down through a family line, usually to the eldest son, and that was the case here. So Amaziah, the king, passes away, and his son Uzziah was given leadership of the nation. Now, the interesting thing about this was that he was, how old? 16 years old. Now, I want you to imagine that for a moment. Okay, parents, imagine your son or daughter getting their driver's permit and then later that same year becoming the president of the United States. All right, just imagine that for a moment. I mean, the kid is barely old enough to shave, and he's given leadership of the nation. He was young, he was inexperienced, and he was undoubtedly overwhelmed by this new responsibility. But can I tell you something? That's a good thing. Because when we feel overwhelmed, then we are driven toward God. It makes us depend on God. It deepens our faith. It strengthens our relationship with Him. And this was certainly the case with Uzziah, because it goes on to say this in verse 4, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Just as his father Amaziah had done, he sought God during the days of Zechariah, that would be the priest, who instructed him in the fear of God. As long as he sought the Lord, God gave him success. Remember that phrase, God gave him success. So get this snapshot, get this picture in your mind. This image of Uzziah at 16 years old as a learner. And at this point in his life, his greatest strength was his humility. Because in his weakness, he sought God. And as he sought God, God gave him success. So his life goes on, and Uzziah becomes the leader of the nation, and he grows in his leadership skills. And the next image that you see of him is Uzziah as a leader. And these next 10 verses give us a description of his leadership success and everything that he accomplished, and it was pretty incredible. Verse 6. He went to war against the Philistines and broke down the walls of Gath, Jabneh, and Ashdod, 3 of the capital cities of the Philistines. He then rebuilt towns near Ashdod and elsewhere among the Philistines. God helped him. Remember that. God helped him against the Philistines and against the Arabs who lived in Gurbaal and against the Meunites. The Ammonites brought tribute to Uzziah, and listen to this, his fame spread as far as the border of Egypt because he had become very powerful. And so internationally, Uzziah became a great success as a leader, and the enemies of the people of God who had attacked them for many years were now held back, and some of them began to respect his leadership and his power. So he's this great successful leader internationally, but also at home as well. He has great success. Verse 9, Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem at the corner gate, at the valley gate, and at the angle of the wall, and he fortified them. He also built towers in the desert and dug many cisterns. That would be a well, because he had much livestock in the foothills and in the plain. So he's doing all these public works projects as well. And the city of Jerusalem and the nation itself, they were thriving. And he develops a well-trained army. It goes on to say this: Uzziah had a well-trained army ready to go out by divisions according to their numbers. The total number of family leaders over the fighting men was 2,600. Under their command was an army of 307,500 men trained for war, a powerful force to support the king against his enemies. And so the nation is becoming stronger. The nation is respected. They are able to defend their borders well. And not only does he build up the army, he gives them the latest technology. Uzziah provided shields, spears, helmets, coats of honor, bows, and sling stones for the entire army. In Jerusalem, he made machines designed by skillful men for use on the towers and on the corner defenses to shoot arrows and hurl large stones, which is in itself awesome, isn't it? A machine that would hurl large stones. So Uzziah is experiencing great success in the eyes of his people and even in the eyes of God. He's becoming a great leader, and the end result of all of it was this: his fame spread far and wide, for he was greatly helped. Remember that. He was greatly helped until he became powerful. So Uzziah was at the top of his game. His resume was impressive. His power was unchallenged. His name was a household word. His fame had spread as far as Egypt. But as his power increased, as his prosperity increased, guess what else increased? His pride. And it happened slowly. It didn't happen overnight. It happened imperceptibly. Maybe he began to linger a little bit too long in front of the palace mirrors. He began to listen a little bit too closely to all the praise he was receiving. He began to be a little bit too enamored with his own success and his own power. Kind of like this guy back in the 80s who was a boxing promoter. His name was Don King. And he was a manager and a promoter for some of the greatest boxing champions in that era. But he was a very colorful guy, even a little bit controversial. And he was being interviewed one time by a newspaper, and here's what he said. He said this. He said, "I never cease to amaze my own self. I say that humbly." How would it come across? How would he say it if he said it with pride? I don't know. I never cease to amaze my own self. See, this was Uzziah's problem. He started to amaze his own self. And the turning point comes in this next verse. But after Uzziah became powerful, his pride led to his downfall. His power made him proud, and in his pride, his life began to plummet. And he becomes proud, which to me is mind-boggling, because let me go back over some of these phrases that we just read. Verse 5, God gave him success. Verse 7, God helped him. Verse 15, he was greatly helped. Verse 16, his pride led to his downfall. So who made Uzziah great? God did. Who took credit for it? Uzziah did. See, one of the ways we know that the poison of pride is beginning to seep into our hearts is when we fail to give credit where credit is due. When we take credit completely ourselves for all the good things in our lives, but never recognize God's blessings and his empowerment and his grace that allowed those good things to happen. It's kind of like my favorite basketball story of all time. It was the night back in the early 90s when the Chicago Bulls played against the Cleveland Cavaliers. And this was the game in which Michael Jordan scored his highest point total ever in a single basketball game. 69 points the guy scored in one game that night. It's amazing. Also playing on the Bulls team that night was another guy named Stacey King. He was a rookie. He scored 1 point on a free throw. Then after the game was over, there was a reporter in the locker room interviewing different players and walked up to interview Stacey King to get his view on the game that night. And here's what he said. He said, "I'll always remember this as the night that Michael Jordan and I combined for 70 points. That's human nature, isn't it? We all want to turn the spotlight on ourselves, and in times of success, there's always the tendency to forget where that came from. And Uzziah, as he makes his way up the ladder of power and influence and possessions. He kind of forgot along the way how he got there. And the same thing can happen to any of us. There's always the tendency, wherever we are in life, to think that we got here by ourselves. And we forget the times of struggle, and we forget the days of weakness, and those times when we cried out to God for help and he answered our prayers in amazing ways. See, my friend, in your lifetime, you may experience some measure of what this world calls success. All of us will experience success as compared to the rest of the world globally. But when you find yourself experiencing that success, don't forget why you're there. Don't forget that everything you enjoy in this world is only by the grace of God. If you're beautiful or strong or gifted or wealthy, it's only because God has allowed you to be beautiful, strong, or gifted or wealthy. And you say, well, the reason I got here is because I worked hard. Well, who gave you the physical health and the strength to work hard? The reason I got here is because I made some really good decisions. Really? Who gave you a mind to make those decisions? Who raised you in that particular family where your education was cared for and nurtured? Who put you in this country where there's so many opportunities? See, don't ever forget. Don't forget. Because when we begin to fail to give credit where credit is due, and we take all the credit ourselves, that's a pretty good indication that pride, the poison of pride, is seeping into our hearts. And that brings us to the third scene, the third picture in the life of Uzziah. But after Uzziah became powerful, his pride led to his downfall. He was unfaithful to the Lord his God and entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. Now, you have to understand that according to Jewish law, there was a clear separation between the duties of the king and the duties of the priest. Uzziah was taking upon himself a responsibility that was never meant to be his. And it didn't matter how great the king was. The king had no right or responsibility to oversee the religious life, the spiritual life of God's people. There was a clear separation between the duties of the king and the duties of the priest. But see, for Uzziah, it wasn't enough for him just to be king. He wanted to be in charge of everything. So here's what happens. Azariah, the priest, with 80 other courageous priests of the Lord, followed him into the temple. They confronted him and said, "It is not right for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord. That is for the priests." Now notice something. Azariah gathers up 80 other priests to go with him. Why did he feel like he needed 80 more? And why did they have to be courageous? I'll tell you why. Because Uzziah, by this point, had developed a reputation. And they knew how difficult it was to reason with him. And they knew how difficult it was to get him to accept instruction from anyone else. And so they had to gather up 81 total people who were courageous to go in and confront this guy's ego. And here's what happens. "Leave the sanctuary, for you have been unfaithful, and you will not be honored by the Lord God." Uzziah, who had a censer in his hand, ready to burn incense, became angry. Now, I want you to stop and think about this picture. This is the king who began his reign as a 16-year-old, humble, completely dependent upon God. And now he's marching through the temple, blasting anyone who has the courage to confront him, saying, "I'm the king. How dare you try to correct me?" Listen, you can tell a lot about the heart of a person by the way they respond to criticism. And one sign that the poison of pride is beginning to seep into your heart is when you find it difficult to admit that you were wrong. And conversely, I think one of the hallmarks of spiritual maturity is when we are teachable, when we are open to the instruction of others, when we are open to correction. And let me tell you what, if it takes 81 courageous people to get you to see the truth, you're in deep trouble. In fact, listen to what Proverbs says here in chapter 15. "He who listens to a life-giving rebuke will be at home among the wise." I hope you never get to the point where your spouse or your kids or your friends just give up on trying to tell you the truth because they know they're going to pay a price for that. And they know that you won't listen anyway. Because if you ever get to that point, you're about to become your own worst enemy because pride has gotten a hold of your heart. So one last picture here. Uzziah as a leper. While he was raging at the priests in their presence before the incense altar in the Lord's temple, leprosy broke out on his forehead. When Azariah, the chief priest, and all the other priests looked at him, they saw that he had leprosy on his forehead, so they hurried him out. Indeed, he himself was eager to leave because the Lord had afflicted him. And so Uzziah had broken the law of God blatantly. He had refused to listen to wise counsel. And so at this moment, God steps in. And Uzziah becomes afflicted with something that they, in those days, called leprosy. It was incurable, and it was contagious. So if you were afflicted with this, it meant that you spent the rest of your life isolated from any human contact. And this is exactly what happens with Uzziah. Listen to the rest of his story. King Uzziah had leprosy until the day he died. He lived in a separate house, leprous, and excluded from the temple of the Lord. Jotham, his son, had charge of the palace and governed the people of the land. Uzziah rested with his ancestors and was buried near them in a cemetery that belonged to the kings, for people said he had leprosy. Listen to this. Leprosy was so feared that they wouldn't even bury him with the rest of his family. He was buried near them because they thought that even after death, there'd be some uncleanness or contamination. In fact, there was a very interesting discovery that was made in 1931. A team of archaeologists uncovered a stone in the city of Jerusalem, and it had an inscription on it. And when translated, it says this: "Herein are the bones of Uzziah, king of Judah, not to be opened." Because leprosy was so feared that people wouldn't even touch the remains of someone who had died from it. This is how he was remembered. Not as the greatest king who ever lived, not as a king who built up the nation's armed forces, not as somebody who was so famous his name was known even to the borders of Egypt. No, the way he was remembered is this: he had leprosy. That was his legacy. If I could chart his life, it would look like this. He began life as a learner, humble. He sought God. As he sought God, God gave him success. He became a great leader. But at the apex of his leadership, pride kicked in. And his pride so consumed him that it created this downward descent where he went from lawbreaker to leper. And it's a tragic story about an end to what could have been a very promising life. And it's a picture of the power of pride to turn us into our own worst enemy. So here's today's habit. Stay humble. Stay humble. In fact, on your way out today, we'll give you a way to remember this. Every week we've been giving away these mirror clings. All you do is peel off the back and you put that on your mirror where you get ready in the morning, because our own worst enemy is always that person we see in the mirror. And this one has an image of a stack of books on it. It's intended to communicate this: don't ever stop learning. Don't ever stop being teachable. Remember that you don't know it all, even if you think you do. Stay humble. So you can take that home, put it on your mirror. Somebody actually sent me a picture last night after the Saturday service when they got home, all 4 of those from every week across the top of their mirror. So I thought that's really, really cool. So that's your reminder of what we talked about, to stay humble. But here's a very important question. How do we do that? How do we specifically go about staying humble? How do we keep the poison of pride from seeping into our hearts? Let me tell you what I think is the best weapon against pride. I think the best weapon against pride is praise. When we consistently find ways to give praise to God for His grace in our lives, when we recognize that He is ultimately the giver of all good things and the one to be worshiped, because when we worship God, we're less inclined to worship ourselves. And that could be as simple as giving a prayer of thanksgiving at the beginning of a meal or at the end of a day and just saying, God, thank you for all the blessings I've enjoyed today. They're not by my own strength. It might mean when you get that paycheck, you just stop and pray and you say, God, thank you for the ability to earn a living. Thank you for my strength. Thank you for my mind. It may mean taking a portion of that income, and as a way of honoring God and putting Him first, you give that to His kingdom. I think it also includes lifting our voices together in a song of worship. Like every time we gather here on Sundays, this is like getting a vaccination against pride. Because when we come, we hear the truth, we engage our voices and hearts in some of these songs, we're just reminding ourselves that He is God, we're not. That He's the creator, we are the creatures, that He is the shepherd, we are just the sheep. that he is the Father and we are his children. And when we worship, when we lift our voices, when we look to God, when we worship him, then we stop worshiping ourselves. And so we're going to end our time together by doing just that. We're going to turn our attention toward the only one who is truly deserving of our praise. And we're going to do that through remembering and then through expressing. We've spent our time today talking about Uzziah, a king who was a great example of pride. I want us to end by thinking about a very different king. A king who was driven not by pride, but a king who was driven by humility. A king who stepped into this broken world, was born as a baby in a manger, who lived the life of a servant, who loved the outcast, who fed the hungry, who washed the feet of his disciples, and who ultimately experienced the greatest humiliation there could be, which was death on the cross. That's the model that we follow. Let me read again from Philippians chapter 2. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. If you're a Christian, that's the example that we follow. We're going to end our time together with the celebration of communion, a way of remembering that cross. And then we're going to join our voices together, celebrating God's faithfulness to us. But in just a moment, a video is going to play, and there's going to be some buckets that will pass down your row. Reach inside and take out one of these. These are the same elements that Jesus shared with his disciples on the night when he was crucified. They're just packaged differently. So in the top, there's a wafer of bread, and then under another cover, there's some juice. You can just take one of those out when the buckets come by, hang on to it, and then Steve, your campus pastor, will come and just walk us through communion. And then right after that, the band will come back, and we'll just celebrate together as we leave here today, God's faithfulness to us. So as the ushers come, just watch this with me.